At 63 years old, Ruth Ellen Watkins had exactly $15 to her name, a cracked phone screen, and a crumpled envelope containing the address of a property she had never visited, in a town she had never heard of. She had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go. But what she discovered when she finally turned the key in the lock of 12, Birchwood Road would shatter everything she thought she knew about her past and change everything she believed about her future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ruth had spent that Tuesday morning sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in the cheapest motel room she could find in Hartford, Connecticut, staring at the $15 remaining in her wallet with the kind of terrible clarity that only arrives when everything else has already been stripped away. Not $15 in a bank account she could access later. Not $15 that belonged to a larger safety net waiting somewhere in the background. Just $15. Physical, folded, slightly damp from the rain that had soaked through her jacket the night before. $15 standing between her and a future she genuinely could not picture. She was 63 years old, and she was completely, devastatingly alone. The motel room smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old carpet that had absorbed too many years of strangers passing through. The heating unit had stopped working sometime around midnight, and Ruth had slept in her coat because there was nothing else to do about it. Outside, the Connecticut morning was gray and indifferent, the kind of sky that doesn't bother making promises. On the small bedside table, next to a lamp with a flickering bulb and a complimentary notepad nobody had ever used, sat the envelope. The envelope that had arrived 3 weeks earlier at her sister Carol's address in New Haven. The envelope that had set everything in motion, though Ruth still hadn't decided what she was going to do about it. The return address read, Whitfield and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Crest Hollow, Vermont. Ruth hadn't recognized the name. She hadn't known anyone in Crest Hollow. She hadn't been certain, if pressed, that she could place Vermont on a map with any confidence beyond knowing it was somewhere north and cold. But the letter inside had been addressed specifically to her, deliberately and unmistakably. Ruth Ellen Watkins, it said, in the precise font of a person who sends letters with full intention behind every word. We are writing to inform you that you have been named as a beneficiary in the estate of the late Lorraine Batista of Crest Hollow, Vermont. Lorraine Batista. Ruth had sat down very suddenly when she read that name, right there in Carol's kitchen with a cup of tea going cold beside her. Lorraine, her mother's oldest sister, the aunt she hadn't spoken to in nearly 18 years. The woman the family had always described with that particular brand of dismissive affection reserved for people who refused to be managed. Difficult, they called her. Independent to the point of selfishness. The kind of woman who did things entirely her own way and offered no apologies for it. The aunt who had sent Ruth a birthday card every single year without exception, even during the years when Ruth had been too consumed by her own unraveling life to send one back. Even during the years when Ruth had told herself she had nothing left worth protecting, including the relationships that had quietly continued loving her from a distance. Lorraine had died at 81, peacefully, in a house that Ruth had never seen. And she had left Ruth something. If you have ever stood at the absolute bottom of a life you didn't plan and cannot fully explain, if you have ever looked at what remains of your savings and felt the number smaller than your fear, if you have ever sat in a cold room at an age when the world expects you to have everything figured out and felt that particular suffocating weight of not knowing what comes next, then this story is for you. Truly, completely for you. Welcome to New Beginnings After 60. And please, before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Because what happened to Ruth Ellen Watkins when she drove north to Crest Hollow, Vermont with $15 in her pocket and nothing left to lose is one of the most breathtaking stories we have ever had the privilege of sharing. And you're going to want to be here for every single word of it. Ruth was not a woman who had been reckless with her life. That was perhaps the most quietly devastating part of where she had ended up. She hadn't made grand, dramatic mistakes she could point to as the obvious source of her unraveling. She hadn't gambled or spent carelessly, or chased things that were never meant for her. She had simply lived the way that so many women of her generation had lived, putting herself last so consistently and so completely that by the time she finally looked up and took honest stock of everything, there's almost nothing left of the life she had once imagined for herself. No savings worth speaking of, no career to return to, no home of her own, no partner, just a suitcase with a broken zipper, a phone she couldn't afford to replace, and a sister who loved her but whose spare room had quietly communicated its temporary nature from the very first night. She had worked hard. She had shown up faithfully. She had given generously to people and situations and obligations that had taken what she offered and moved on without looking back. And somehow, despite all of that, despite a lifetime of quiet, consistent effort, at 63 years old, she found herself holding $15 and an envelope from an attorney she had never heard of, representing an aunt she had almost let herself forget. What Ruth could not have known yet, sitting in that cold motel room with her coat still buttoned and her hands wrapped around the envelope for warmth as much as purpose, was that Lorraine Batista had not simply left her property out of obligation or sentiment. Lorraine had spent years building something deliberate, protecting something carefully, preparing something extraordinary for the precise moment when Ruth would have nothing left and nowhere else to turn. That moment had arrived, and everything was about to change. Ruth Ellen Watkins had been born the second of 3 daughters to Eleanor and George Watkins of New Haven, Connecticut, in a small house on Pemberton Street that always smelled like coffee and slightly burnt toast. Her father worked at a printing company for 31 years. Her mother sewed alterations for a dry-cleaning business 2 blocks from their house, sitting at the same machine every evening after dinner until her eyes gave out and she had to stop. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. But they were steady people, and Ruth had grown up believing that steadiness was its own kind of fortune. That if you worked hard and showed up faithfully and kept your promises, life would eventually meet you halfway with something solid to stand on. It was a belief that took decades to fully disprove. She had been a bright student, the kind of girl her teachers called conscientious, which is the word adults use when they want to praise a child without quite committing to calling her brilliant. Ruth had wanted to study architecture. She had sketched buildings in her notebooks since she was 9 years old, filling margins with impossible staircases and window arrangements and roof lines that curve in ways she had seen nowhere except inside her own imagination. Her high school guidance counselor had looked at her sketches with genuine interest and told her she had real talent. Her father had looked at the tuition costs for architecture programs and told her gently, practically, in the way that parents in tight circumstances deliver difficult truths to children they love, that perhaps something more attainable would be wiser. So Ruth had studied bookkeeping at a 2-year college in New Haven. She had been good at it. She had found work almost immediately after graduating at a mid-sized manufacturing company that made industrial fasteners, and she had stayed there for 11 years, becoming indispensable in the quiet way that reliable people always become indispensable, noticed mostly in the abstract and rarely in any concrete, compensated way. At 31, she had married a man named Dennis Watkins, a contractor with an easy laugh and ambitious plans that always seemed to exist somewhere just beyond the horizon of actual execution. Dennis was charming in the particular way that makes a person's flaws invisible until they are suddenly, catastrophically visible all at once. Ruth had loved him genuinely and worked alongside his dreams faithfully, taking on extra bookkeeping clients in the evenings to supplement their income during the stretches when his contracting work went quiet, which it did with increasing frequency as the years passed. They had no children. That had been a grief Ruth carried privately, folded away in a place she rarely examined, because examining it changed nothing and cost everything. The marriage lasted 14 years. Dennis left on a Wednesday in March, taking his tools, his truck, and approximately 60% of their shared savings account, which Ruth had not known he had access to because she had trusted him the way you trust someone you have built a life beside. The divorce was as uncomplicated as the absence of children and shared assets can make these things, which is to say was still devastating, just efficiently so. Ruth was 45 when she started over. She told herself 45 was not old. She believed it, mostly. She found a smaller apartment, took on more clients, rebuilt her savings slowly and carefully, the way you rebuild anything after a flood, cautiously, watching the walls for signs of water damage that might not show itself immediately. For 12 years, she did well enough. Not abundantly, not in any way that felt like the life she had once sketched in notebook margins, but well enough to feel stable, well enough to exhale occasionally. Then the company she had spent those 12 years serving as a contract bookkeeper was acquired by a larger firm that brought its own financial team and had no use for independent contractors. Ruth was 57. The freelance work she had always supplemented her income with had dried up in an industry moving rapidly towards software that could do in seconds what had taken her careful, skilled hours. She spent 2 years trying to adapt, taking online courses, learning new systems, applying for positions that went to candidates 20 years younger without a second glance at her resume. By 60, she had depleted most of what she had rebuilt. By 62, she was in Carol's spare room with a suitcase and a pride she was learning to set aside piece by piece, the way you unpack only what you absolutely need and leave the rest in the bag, hoping you'll not be there long enough to need it. And throughout all of it, through the marriage and the divorce and the rebuilding and the collapse and the spare room and the $15, there had been the birthday cards. Every single year, without fail. A card from Crest Hollow, Vermont, in Lorraine Batista's angular, decisive handwriting, always containing the same closing line regardless of what the card said on the front. "You're more than they see, Ruth. Don't you dare forget it." Ruth had kept every single one of them. 41 cards in a rubber-banded stack at the bottom of her suitcase. 41 years of a woman believing in her from a distance. She had not understood why until now. The letter from Whitfield & Associates had arrived on a Thursday, and Ruth had read it 4 times before she allowed herself to believe it was real. The language was formal and precise in the way that legal correspondence always is, careful and measured, as if the words themselves were aware of the weight they carried and were trying not to drop anything. It informed Ruth that her aunt, Lorraine Batista, had passed away 6 weeks prior at the age of 81. It informed her that Lorraine had left a valid and properly executed will. It informed her that Ruth Ellen Watkins had been named as a specific beneficiary within that will and was requested to attend a formal reading at the offices of Whitfield & Associates in Crest Hollow, Vermont, on the 14th of the month. There was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the formal letter, which surprised Ruth. Attorneys did not typically attach handwritten notes, but this one did, and it said in small, careful script that somehow communicated both professionalism and genuine human feeling simultaneously. "Ms. Watkins, I knew your aunt for many years, and I am deeply sorry for your loss. I would strongly encourage you to attend the reading in person if at all possible. Lorraine was very specific about wanting you there. It matters. James Whitfield. It matters." Ruth had stared at those 2 words for a long time. Carol had driven her to the bus station on the morning of the 14th because Ruth's car had stopped running 8 months earlier, and she hadn't had the means to replace it. The bus ticket to Burlington, Vermont had cost $11.40, which left Ruth with $3.60 after she bought a coffee and a granola bar at the station, because she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and she knew she needed to be functional for whatever was waiting at the other end of the journey. She had not allowed herself to think too specifically about what the will might contain. Hope, she had learned, was a resource that needed to be managed carefully when you were operating on empty. You couldn't afford to spend it recklessly on possibilities that might dissolve the moment you reached for them. The Whitfield & Associates office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on Crest Hollow's Main Street, reached by a staircase that creaked pleasantly in the way that old buildings creak, as if they're simply breathing. James Whitfield was a tall man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm, unhurried manner that suggested he had sat with people through enough difficult moments that he had stopped being rattled by any of them. He greeted Ruth with a handshake that was firm without being aggressive and offered her tea before anything else, which she accepted gratefully because the bus had been cold and the walk from the station had been longer than she'd anticipated. The conference room was small. A round table with 4 chairs, a window overlooking the street below, a shelf of legal volumes that had clearly been consulted rather than displayed. Ruth sat on one side. 2 other people sat on the other. She recognized them immediately, though she hadn't seen either of them in nearly a decade. Bradley Simmons and Sandra Simmons Holt, Lorraine's nephew and niece from her late husband's side of the family. Bradley was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and expensively dressed in the way of someone who needs other people to register their success before they have spoken a single word. Sandra was a year or 2 younger, sharp-eyed, wearing the particular expression of someone who has already calculated the numbers and arrived at a figure they are satisfied with. A third chair remained empty. Todd Simmons, Sandra's brother, had apparently sent his attorney instead, a young woman in a gray suit who sat beside Sandra and said nothing for the duration of the reading. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James Whitfield opened a folder and began reading with the quiet, measured authority of a man who understood that the words in front of him were going to land differently on different people in the room and who had made his peace with that reality long before any of them arrived. Lorraine Batista's estate, he explained, consisted of 3 primary components. The first was a savings account containing approximately $42,000. The second was a collection of personal property, including furniture, artwork, and household contents. The third was a piece of real estate located at 12 Birchwood Road, Crest Hollow, Vermont, consisting of the main house and the surrounding land. Bradley straightened visibly when Whitfield reached the real estate portion. Sandra's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the edge of the table. The young attorney in the gray suit uncapped her pen. The savings account, Whitfield continued, was to be divided equally between Bradley Simmons, Sandra Simmons Holt, and Todd Simmons, representing $14,000 each, subject to existing estate taxes and legal fees. Bradley nodded slowly, already doing the arithmetic. The personal property was similarly to be divided among the 3 siblings as they saw fit, to be arranged through mutual agreement within 90 days of the reading. Sandra allowed herself a small, satisfied exhale. Then James Whitfield looked up from the document, found Ruth's eyes across the round table, and said the words that would change everything. The property at 12 Birchwood Road, including the house, all structures on the land, and all contents therein, is left in its entirety to my niece, Ruth Ellen Watkins. No conditions, no restrictions, no shared ownership of any kind. It is hers completely and irrevocably. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ruth had ever heard. Bradley was the first to speak, which surprised nobody. He had the particular quality of men who have never learned to sit with discomfort for longer than 30 seconds before converting it into aggression. He leaned forward in his chair, both forearms flat on the table, and looked at Ruth with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite confusion, but existed somewhere in the unsettling territory between the two. "I'm sorry," he said, in a tone that communicated he was not sorry at all. "Can you repeat that? Because I want to make absolutely certain I understood correctly." James Whitfield repeated it, calmly, precisely, without alteration. "The property at 12 Birchwood Road, including the house, all structures on the land, and all contents therein, is left in its entirety to Ruth Ellen Watkins." Sandra set her teacup down with a sharp, deliberate click that seemed to contain an entire argument within it. She turned to look at Ruth with the slow, measuring quality of someone appraising an object they have just been told is worth considerably more than it appears. Ruth held her gaze and said nothing, because she had not yet found words adequate to the moment, and she had learned long ago that silence was frequently more powerful than anything she might say into it. "Lorraine barely knew this woman," Sandra said, addressing Whitfield rather than Ruth directly, as if Ruth were not present in the room. They hadn't spoken in years. We were her family. Her actual, consistent, present family. We were the ones who checked on her. We were the ones who called. Whatever relationship Lorraine thought she had with Ruth was nostalgic sentiment at best. This should be challenged. The attorney in the gray suit was already writing. You are, of course, entitled to explore any legal options available to you, Whitfield said, with the calm of someone who had anticipated this response and prepared for it thoroughly. However, I should inform you that this will was drafted 8 years ago, reviewed and updated annually, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and Lorraine was assessed by her physician as being in full cognitive capacity at each update. She was, if anything, more deliberate about this specific bequest than any other element of her estate. Bradley stood up, not because there was anywhere to go, but because sitting had become intolerable to him. He walked to the window, looked down at the street below, and then turned back to the room with the expression of a man attempting to reorganize a situation that refuses to be reorganized. His eyes settled on Ruth with a weight that was meant to intimidate. "You know this isn't right," he said. "You know that. You disappeared from her life for nearly 20 years, and now you're going to walk away with the most valuable piece of her estate while we get divided scraps? That's not family. That's opportunism." Ruth felt the words land, felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to apologize, to smooth the discomfort in the room at the cost of her own dignity, the same instinct that had operated in her quietly and consistently for 63 years. She felt it rise up, and she set it down deliberately, the way you set down something heavy you have been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of you. "I didn't ask to be named in her will," Ruth said quietly. "I didn't know about it until the letter arrived, and I won't apologize for something Lorraine chose to do of her own free will." Bradley made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Enjoy the fantasy while it lasts," he said. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, buttoned it with the precise, controlled movements of someone channeling fury into small physical tasks, and walked out. Sandra followed without looking at Ruth. The attorney in the gray suit gathered her papers, offered Whitfield a professional nod, and left. The room was suddenly very quiet. Whitfield waited until the footsteps on the staircase had faded before he looked at Ruth with something in his expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but lived in the honest space between them. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside, he said, was the deed to the property, already transferred into her name, along with a key and a letter Lorraine had written specifically for Ruth and asked him to include. He had one more thing to tell her, he said, and he wanted her to hear it clearly. Whatever Bradley and Sandra were planning, and they were clearly planning something, the will was airtight. Lorraine had made certain of it. Ruth drove the $38 she didn't have to a motel that night, charged a Carol's emergency card with a promise to repay it somehow, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, holding the manila envelope in both hands, too overwhelmed to open it, too afraid to set it down. Outside, Crest Hollow, Vermont was perfectly, indifferently quiet, and Ruth Ellen Watkins sat alone in the dark with a property she had never seen and $3.60 to her name, and a fear so enormous it had its own particular silence. She was 63 years old, and she had absolutely no idea what came next. Ruth opened the manila envelope at 6:14 in the morning, sitting cross-legged on the motel bed with a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders and the bedside lamp casting a pale yellow circle of light across the comforter. She had not slept. She had spent the hours between midnight and dawn moving in and out of something that resembled sleep the way a shallow puddle resembles a lake. Close enough in appearance to fool you briefly, but containing nothing you could actually submerge yourself in. Every time she had drifted close to genuine rest, her mind had pulled her back with the particular cruelty that anxious minds specialize in, cycling through Bradley's voice, Sandra's expression, the attorney's careful pen, the number $3.60 repeating itself like a broken signal. The deed was on top, printed on heavy legal paper with the official stamps and signatures that transform a document from a piece of paper into a fact. Ruth Ellen Watkins, it stated, is the sole owner of the property located at 12 Birchwood Road, Crest Hollow, Vermont. She read her own name 3 times. It did not become more believable with repetition, but it did become more real, which is a different thing entirely. Beneath the deed was the key. It was old, substantially older than she had expected, made of dark iron with an ornate bow at the top that had been worn smooth by decades of handling. It was the kind of key that belonged to a specific kind of door, a heavy door, a door with intention behind it. Ruth held it in her palm for a long moment and felt the weight of it, which was surprisingly considerable for something so small. The letter was last. It was written on plain white paper in Lorraine's handwriting, which Ruth recognized immediately from 41 years of birthday cards. Angular, decisive, slightly left-leaning, the handwriting of a woman who knew her own mind and moved through the world accordingly. Ruth, it began without preamble, which was entirely consistent with everything Ruth remembered about Lorraine Batista. I know we lost years. I know that was partly my fault and partly the fault of a family that never quite knew what to do with either of us, which is probably why I always felt we were more alike than anyone realized. I've been watching from a distance for a long time, the way that stubborn old women watch the people they love when they don't know how to close the gap without making everything awkward. I am sorry I didn't try harder to close it sooner. I want to tell you about the house before you see it, because I don't want you to arrive with someone else's description in your head. People in this family have a habit of deciding what things are worth before they've looked at them properly. I don't want that to happen to you with this place. The house is old. It needs attention in places. The garden has been somewhat left to its own devices these past 2 years, since my knees stopped cooperating with my ambitions. But it is structurally sound, it is paid for completely, and it sits on land that is worth considerably more than anyone in our family ever bothered to find out, because none of them ever thought it worth their time to look. Go there, Ruth. Go and look properly. Don't let anyone tell you what it is before you've seen it for yourself. All my love, always, Lorraine. Ruth folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing in particular, feeling something shift inside her chest in the quiet, tectonic way that important things shift, not dramatically, not with any visible announcement, but with a permanence that you understand immediately, even if you cannot articulate it yet. She checked out of the motel at 7, thanked the woman at the front desk who had been kind enough to not comment on the fact that she had paid with someone else's emergency card, and walked back out into the Vermont morning. The air was sharper than Hartford, cleaner in a way that felt almost aggressive after years of city air, and the sky was the particular shade of pale blue that only exists in early morning before the day has fully committed to its own weather. She had $3.60. She had an iron key. She had a deed with her name on it. She had a letter from a woman who had believed in her for 41 years from a careful, patient distance. It was, she decided, enough to start with. The walk from the motel to 12, Birchwood Road, took 23 minutes. Ruth had gotten the directions from Whitfield's assistant the previous afternoon, memorizing them because she couldn't afford to use her data and the motel's Wi-Fi had been unreliable. Main Street to Birchwood Lane, left at the old water tower, follow the road until the pavement ends, then continue on the dirt track through the tree line until you reach the clearing. She heard the property before she saw it. A sound she couldn't immediately identify, low and rhythmic, and somehow deeply familiar despite having no specific memory to attach it to. It took her another 30 seconds of walking before she recognized it as wind moving through very old, very large trees. The sound that ancient oaks make when a morning breeze finds them, a sound that is less like wind and more like breathing. Then the tree line broke open, and Ruth Ellen Watkins stopped walking entirely. She stood at the edge of the clearing with the iron key in her hand and looked at 12 Birchwood Road for the first time, and felt every preconceived notion she had carefully not allowed herself to form dissolve completely in an instant. It was not what she had feared. It was not what anyone had implied. It was not a ruin or a burden or a liability dressed up in legal language to look like a gift. It was something else entirely. Something she had no immediate words for, standing there in the early Vermont morning with the oak trees breathing around her and the iron key warm in her palm. It was a beginning. The house at 12 Birchwood Road was built from dark fieldstone and heavy timber, 2 stories with a roof that had clearly been recently repaired, slate tiles sitting flush and solid against the Vermont sky. The windows were tall and narrow with wooden frames painted a deep, forest green that had weathered beautifully rather than deteriorating, the kind of weathering that speaks to quality of original material rather than neglect. A wide-covered porch ran the full length of the front facade, its boards worn smooth from decades of use. Two wooden chairs sitting at one end, as if someone had simply stepped inside for a moment and intended to return. Climbing roses, unpruned but abundantly alive, covered the eastern wall of the house in an enthusiastic tangle of deep red blooms that smelled extraordinary in the cool morning air. The surrounding land was considerable. Ruth could not gauge the full extent of it from where she stood, but the clearing itself was large, and beyond it the oak trees continued in every direction for as far as she could see, massive ancient things that had clearly been growing here long before anyone thought to build a house among them. To the left of the main structure was a smaller building, a barn or workshop, its doors closed but its roof intact. To the right, the remains of what had clearly been a substantial kitchen garden, the bones of organized raised beds still visible beneath 2 years of enthusiastic overgrowth, herbs gone wild and productive despite the absence of cultivation, tomato cages still standing at odd angles amid a riot of greenery. Ruth walked the stone path to the front door slowly, taking in everything, cataloging details with the systematic attention of someone who had spent decades working with numbers and understood that accurate assessment requires patience and specificity. The foundation was solid. The porch boards flexed slightly underfoot, but did not give in any way that suggested structural compromise. The windows were intact, every single one of them, not a crack or a missing pane anywhere. The front door was heavy oak, darkened with age, fitted with an iron lock that matched the key in her hand with unmistakable deliberateness. She was still standing on the porch, key raised toward the lock, when she heard footsteps on the stone path behind her. The woman approaching was somewhere in her mid-70s, compact and purposeful, wearing a canvas work jacket over a floral shirt and carrying a wicker basket in the crook of one arm with the easy confidence of someone who has carried wicker baskets their entire life and sees no reason to make anything of it. Her white hair was cut practically short. Her eyes were a sharp, observant gray that registered Ruth completely in the first second and filed everything away with obvious efficiency. "You'll be Ruth," she said. It was not a question. It had the quality of a fact being confirmed rather than a guess being ventured. "Yes," Ruth said. "How did you know?" "Lorraine described you well enough," the woman said, climbing the porch steps without breaking stride and setting her basket down on one of the wooden chairs. "And you have her eyes around the corners. I noticed it immediately." She extended a hand. "Agnes Kowalski. I run the community center on Maple Street, though I also run approximately everything else in this town, depending on who you ask. I have bread, coffee, eggs, and a jar of preserves Lorraine made last summer. I thought you might need something before we talk." Ruth shook her hand and felt immediately, inexplicably steadied by the firmness of it. Agnes produced a small key from her jacket pocket and held it up briefly before using it to open the door herself, explaining that Lorraine had given her a copy years ago for maintenance purposes. The door swung inward and Ruth followed Agnes across the threshold into 12 Birchwood Road. But what stopped Ruth completely was the work table. It ran nearly the full length of the room's center, a massive, solid oak surface covered with organized papers, notebooks, hand-drawn maps, and what appeared to be architectural sketches. Ruth moved closer and looked at the papers with growing confusion that shifted slowly, incrementally, into something approaching disbelief. The sketches were of the property. Detailed professional quality drawings of the house, the barn, the land. But they weren't preservation documents or historical records. They were development plans, renovation specifications, projected cost analyses, environmental assessments, and paperclipped to the front of the entire collection was a single typed cover sheet with a heading that made Ruth's breath stop completely in her chest. Birchwood Road Conservation and Retreat Development Proposal. Prepared for Ruth Ellen Watkins. Commissioned by Lorraine Batista. Completed 8 months prior to this reading. Agnes set 2 mugs of coffee on the edge of the work table and looked at Ruth with the patient expression of someone who has delivered significant information before and understands that the recipient needs a moment. "She spent 4 years on this," Agnes said quietly. "She hired a land surveyor, an environmental consultant, an architect, and a conservation specialist. All paid for, all documented. She knew exactly what this land was worth and exactly what it could become. She just needed the right person to carry it forward. Ruth set her hand flat on the cover sheet and felt the solidity of the table beneath it, the realness of the paper, the weight of 4 years of someone else's belief in her. "Why me?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not someone with resources, with experience, with the means to actually do something with this?" Agnes wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at Ruth with that sharp gray gaze that missed nothing and softened only when it chose to. "Because Lorraine said you were the only person in her life who had ever loved something and tended it faithfully without needing to own it or control it or take credit for it. She said that kind of person is the only kind of person you trust with something that matters." She paused. "She also said you had been waiting your whole life for permission to begin. She wanted to be the one to give it to you." Ruth sat down on the nearest chair because standing had become optional. Outside, the ancient oaks breathed steadily around the clearing. And inside, Ruth Ellen Watkins began, very slowly, to understand what Lorraine Batista had actually left her. They arrived on a Saturday morning, 10 days after Ruth had moved into 12 Birchwood Road. She heard the car before she saw it. The sound of an expensive engine navigating the dirt track through the tree line with the particular reluctance of a vehicle that has never been asked to do anything so undignified as drive on unpaved road. She was on the porch with her second cup of coffee and the land surveyor's report open across her knees, having spent the previous 4 days methodically working through every document Lorraine had assembled on the work table, reading each one carefully and completely, the way she had once read financial ledgers, looking for the full picture before forming any conclusions. Bradley's car was a black Mercedes that looked deeply unhappy about the dirt. Sandra was in the passenger seat. Todd, whom Ruth was seeing for the first time, was in the back, a thinner, quieter version of Bradley with the same calculating eyes and a more carefully managed expression. They parked at the edge of the clearing and climbed out, and Ruth watched them take in the property with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people rapidly revising an estimate upward and finding the revision deeply irritating. She did not go to meet them. She stayed on the porch and waited, which was a choice that communicated more than any word she might have offered. Bradley reached the porch steps first and stopped with both hands in his coat pockets, looking up at her with an expression assembled to project casual authority. It did not entirely succeed. "Peggy, we need to talk," he said. "Ruth," she said pleasantly. "My name is Ruth. We've met several times over the years, Bradley." A flicker of something crossed his face. "Ruth, we need to talk about the property situation. Our attorneys have been reviewing the will, and we believe there are grounds for a formal challenge." "Come in," Ruth said, standing. "I'll make coffee." She seated them in the main room around the work table, which she had deliberately not cleared of Lorraine's documents and plans. She watched their eyes move across the surveyor's reports, the architectural drawings, the environmental assessments, and she watched comprehension arrive on each of their faces at different speeds and with different degrees of visible discomfort. Sandra's gaze lingered on the cover sheet the longest. Ruth poured coffee, distributed mugs, and sat across from them with her hands folded and her expression entirely composed. Todd spoke first, which surprised her. "We've had the land independently assessed," he said, with the measured tone of someone delivering prepared remarks. "This property and the surrounding acreage is valued at considerably more than anyone understood when Lorraine's will was written. We believe the estate should be reopened and all assets reassessed before any final distribution." "On what grounds?" Ruth asked. "On the grounds that Lorraine significantly undervalued this property in her estate documentation," Sandra said, finding her voice now, sharpening it in the familiar way Ruth remembered from the conference room. "Which means the distribution was based on inaccurate information. Bradley and Todd and I received $14,000 each, while you received a property worth potentially 10 to 15 times that amount. That is not equitable distribution." Ruth nodded slowly, as if considering this carefully. Then she stood and walked to the bookshelves along the far wall, where she had placed a single brown folder the previous evening in preparation for exactly this conversation. She carried it back to the table and set it down between them without opening it. This folder contains documentation that Lorraine's attorney provided along with the deed, Ruth said. It includes an independent land assessment commissioned by Lorraine herself 18 months ago, which establishes the property's value clearly and was fully disclosed to her estate attorney during the will's most recent update. James Whitfield will confirm that the will was drafted with complete knowledge of the property's assessed value. Lorraine knew exactly what she was giving me and exactly what she was giving you. She made those decisions deliberately and with full legal competence, as documented by her physician annually for the past 8 years. She opened the folder and turned it to face them. The assessment figures were clearly visible at the top of the first page. Bradley leaned forward, read the number, and sat back. Something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but permanently, the way posture shifts when a person accepts something they have been refusing to accept. There is something else in this folder, Ruth continued, her voice remaining entirely level. Lorraine kept detailed personal records throughout her life. Correspondence, financial documentation, records of various family arrangements and agreements, and private matters that certain people would strongly prefer remain private. She paused. I have not read all of it. I don't intend to use any of it unless I am given a compelling reason to do so. But I want you to know it exists, and that it is now legally mine along with everything else in this house. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks in that low, steady, breathing way that Ruth had already come to find deeply reassuring. Sandra looked at the folder, then at Ruth, then at Bradley in a way that contained an entire conversation conducted entirely in the language of shared history and mutual self-interest. If we pursue a legal challenge, Todd said carefully, and it is unsuccessful, what happens? Then we have spent significant money and time on a process that changes nothing legally and damages several relationships and reputations irreparably, Ruth said. James Whitfield has already confirmed the will is airtight. Your own attorneys will tell you the same thing if they review the documentation honestly rather than telling you what you want to hear. Bradley picked up his coffee mug, looked into it for a moment, and set it down. And if we walk away, then we go our separate ways, Ruth said simply. You have your inheritances. I have this property. Lorraine's wishes are honored. Nobody needs to spend the next 2 years in courtrooms. They left 40 minutes later. Not warmly, not with any pretense of resolution or reconciliation. But they left without threats and without the attorney in the gray suit and without any of the aggressive posturing that Bradley had arrived, carrying like a weapon he expected to need. Todd shook Ruth's hand at the door, briefly, without meeting her eyes, but he shook it. Sandra said nothing but nodded once at the threshold, a small, tight acknowledgement that managed to communicate both defeat and a reluctant species of respect. Bradley walked to the Mercedes without looking back. Ruth stood on the porch and watched the black car navigate the dirt track back through the tree line until the sound of the engine disappeared entirely into the Vermont morning. Then she went inside, sat down at Lorraine's work table, picked up the land surveyor's report where she had left off, and continued reading. Agnes arrived an hour later with soup and fresh bread and the expectant expression of someone who has been waiting for a report. They're gone, Ruth said. Agnes set the soup on the kitchen counter and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted the outcome. Good, she said. Now we can get to work. Spring arrived in Crest Hollow the way spring arrives in Vermont, not with any particular announcement or dramatic gesture, but gradually and then all at once, the way that important things tend to happen. One morning the oaks at the edge of the clearing were bare, and the next morning they were not, and the kitchen garden that Ruth had spent the winter months planning and the early spring weeks preparing erupted into organized, productive life with a generosity that felt almost personal. She had rebuilt the raised beds with help from 2 retired men from town who asked for nothing in return except conversation and coffee, both of which Ruth provided in abundance. She had planted herbs along the south-facing wall of the house where the stone held warmth long after the sun moved on. She had cleared the climbing roses on the eastern wall and pruned them back to healthy structure, and they had responded by blooming in April with an extravagance that stopped Agnes mid-sentence the first morning she arrived to see it. 6 months had passed since the black Mercedes had disappeared down the dirt track and taken Bradley and Sandra and Todd with it. 6 months since James Whitfield had called to confirm that the legal challenge had been formally withdrawn and the will was closed and settled permanently. 6 months of waking up every morning in a house that was hers, on land that was hers, in a community that had absorbed her with the natural, unpretentious warmth of a place that values people for what they actually are rather than what they can be positioned to represent. The transformation of 12, Birchwood Road had begun in earnest in January, guided by the architectural plans Lorraine had commissioned and refined by Ruth's own careful study of every document on the work table. She had contacted the conservation specialist whose name appeared in Lorraine's files, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, based in Burlington, who had driven down in February and walked the full extent of the acreage with Ruth over 2 days, explaining in patient, specific detail what the land contained and what it could support. The oaks alone, Dr. Osei explained, represented a conservation asset of extraordinary significance. Several of the largest specimens were estimated to be over 300 years old, qualifying the property for a protected designation that would simultaneously preserve the land permanently and generate conservation funding that could support the property's development indefinitely. Ruth had listened to everything and asked careful, specific questions and taken detailed notes in the margins of Lorraine's documents, the way she had once annotated financial ledgers, building complete understanding from accumulated detail. Then she had gone back to the work table and spent 3 weeks refining the development proposal into something that was entirely her own vision, shaped by Lorraine's foundation, but extended and deepened by everything Ruth had learned about herself in 6 months of living, for the first time in her adult life, entirely on her own terms. The barn to the left of the main house was being converted into a workshop and gathering space. The cottage plan she had found in Lorraine's files had been submitted to the town planning board and approved without objection, because Crest Hollow was exactly the kind of small community that understands the value of what Ruth was building. The retreat center would open in autumn with capacity for 12 guests at a time. Women in transition, women starting over, women who needed time and space and community, and the particular permission that comes from being in a place specifically designed to tell you that beginning again at any age is not only possible, but worthy of celebration and support. She was going to call it Birchwood House. Not Morrison, not Batista, not Watkins. Birchwood, name for the road, the land, the place itself. Because the place was the point. The place was what Lorraine had protected and prepared and passed forward. Ruth was simply the person trusted to carry it into its next chapter. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Ruth sat on the restored porch with her coffee and watched the clearing fill with the particular quality of spring light that exists only in the first weeks of the season, before summer asserts itself and the light thickens and softens. The fountain Agnes had helped her restore in the garden was running, its sound weaving through the birdsong in a way that felt deliberate, curated, as if the property itself had opinions about acoustics. The raised beds were green and purposeful. The roses on the eastern wall were building toward their second bloom of the season. The oaks stood at the edge of the clearing in their ancient, breathing permanence, and Ruth sat among all of it and felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to correctly identify it. She felt like herself, completely, quietly, unhurriedly herself. She was 63 years old. She had arrived here with $15 and an iron key and a letter from a woman who had believed in her for 4 decades from a careful distance. She had been dismissed and threatened and underestimated by people who had looked at her and seen only what she lacked. She had stood in a cold motel room in the dark and genuinely not known how the next chapter of her life would begin, or whether it would begin at all. And here she was, building something real, belonging somewhere genuine, living a life that was entirely, irreversibly her own. Ruth thought about Lorraine as she did every morning. She thought about 41 birthday cards in a rubber-banded stack and the same closing line written faithfully across 4 decades. You're more than they see, Ruth. Don't you dare forget it. She thought about an elderly woman in a canvas work jacket driving to Burlington to hire a conservation specialist, commissioning architectural drawings, building a proposal for a future she would not live to see but believed in completely. She thought about what it means to love someone that specifically and that patiently and that practically, to love them not with grand gestures but with careful, sustained preparation, with the quiet, determined work of building something that would still be standing long after you were gone. Lorraine Batista had spent 4 years building Ruth a beginning. Ruth intended to spend the rest of her life being worthy of it. The retreat center would open in October. Agnes had already compiled a waiting list of 12 women. Dr. Osei had connected Ruth with a conservation grant that would fund the property's protected designation in perpetuity. James Whitfield had helped her establish a small foundation in Lorraine's name that would provide annual scholarships for women over 50 pursuing new careers or educational opportunities, funded by a portion of the conservation proceeds. Ruth picked up her coffee mug and held it in both hands and looked out at the clearing and the oaks and the spring sky above Crest Hollow, Vermont, and made herself a promise, quietly and without ceremony, the way that the most important promises tend to be made. She was just getting started. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, if you have ever held $15 in an impossible decision and chosen the direction that terrified you most, if you have ever been seen fully and specifically by someone who loved you enough to prepare for your future before you could see it yourself, leave one word in the comments. Just one word describing what you felt in the moment you realized that what looked like an ending was actually the most important beginning of your life. Because Ruth's story and Lorraine's gift and that iron key turning in the lock of a forgotten house in a small Vermont town prove something worth carrying with you. That being overlooked is not the same as being unworthy. That being discarded is not the same as being without value. That sometimes the most profound love expresses itself not in grand public declarations, but in quiet, patient, sustained preparation for the moment when the person you believe in will finally need what you have been carefully building for them. You are more than they see. Don't you dare forget it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.